Hey everyone, this is Luke with Serverless Guru, and today we're going to run over how to create a file creation and hosting website using AWS AppSync. We're going to start by following an AWS samples GitHub tutorial in order to get us to this final web page. It has some basic login capabilities, shows all the different files you've uploaded, and allows you to upload different ones. After going through that process, we're going to take a small dive into the front end and back end code so that you can see both how the front end is creating queries and calling them, and then also how the back end is receiving those queries and putting them against our database using AWS AppSync. Beyond that, we're going to create our own functionality by creating a delete button that is not available on the base tutorial. This will be a good exercise in editing and manipulating this own project so that you can sort of feel comfortable building your own things from here on out. And then I'll just finish up with a couple tips that I think will be helpful moving forward. As a base note, I'd say the prerequisites for this video are pretty low, but at a minimum, you want to at least have an AWS account where you're already logged in. You can pull into resources like AppSync, Cognito, S3, and so forth. You don't need a ton of experience with them, but at least to have had that event created. And additionally, just to have a slight level of experience with GraphQL. You don't need to know a whole lot, maybe just an hour or so, but you at least want these different sort of files with mutations and fields and so forth to look vaguely familiar so that you can follow along as the whole video goes on. With all of that out of the way, I'd say let's go ahead and get started and just download the tutorial. I've picked this one because it's from the official AWS samples GitHub, and also because it was built in React, which is my preferred front-end language. If you're not familiar with React, that's totally fine. The base principles of all of this still stay the same, so you could follow through your own with Angular, or just sort of keep tips on where to plug in your own technologies. So how this video or tutorial gets set up is using the AWS Amplify, which pretty much helps us throw together an app straight from scratch using a bunch of other different AWS technologies. It's going to be using things like Cognito for logging in and S3 for photo storage, which we're really not going to get too much into, but it's worth knowing that Amplify is helping us do that and doing so easily. What we are going to focus on are these three in the middle, having the browser and user on the browser making requests and mutations to the database that we're creating in DynamoDB, and having AppSync handle all of those requests, accurately putting those over, making changes, and then putting those back in real time. And we are going to start that out by using the Amplify setup. Now, I debated walking through this video with you guys, but for one, the defaults are just fine as is, so it seemed a little redundant to walk you through it. And additionally, some of the installation processes take a while because they're creating resources and all of these things we just mentioned, which does take a while. So I'll just say for starters that these prerequisites and instructions should seem pretty bare level if you've worked with AWS before. Nothing too new here. Just, creating a repository, initializing a bunch of different options, which again, the defaults are fine, or if it wants a name, should be obvious. The only weird thing in here was that Cognito would like you to have AWS credentials already available inside of your console. And so if you don't have that, I'd recommend it. Otherwise, I think it should work fine as long as you leave that portion out and don't worry about logging in and logging out. So yeah, once you get all of that set up and deployed at the end, then just right out of the box, you should already be at this square. Nothing too crazy going on here. If you look at the actual code itself, you can see kind of where the base level is, but also the files that have been created and modified by Amplify. There are a number that I think are valuable, like say JSON and the YAML, but I'm just going to focus on the couple that are relevant to this tutorial. For starters, we have a base level schema that has been created in the backend. If you've worked with GraphQL before, this should be really familiar, but for those of you who haven't, it's pretty much just clarifying which types of mutations, queries, and objects are allowed to exist. So here we're defining what a picture object is. Here we're defining what an input is for an S3 object. Down here we're going to be naming some query types and so forth. So it's pretty simple. Additionally, if in these selections in Amplify, there's one request that allows you to auto-create queries. And so if you did so, you'll find those in this GraphQL file in src. The tutorial creators already made their own mutation query list, but they don't have a delete one. And what's interesting is that Amplify kind of already created these for us. And you can see that they've created not just the single list pictures, but they've created a single one. And for mutations, they've created create, update, and delete mutations for all of those. And they all work just fine. And so we can definitely use these as a base moving forward. Lastly, there's an AWS Exports File, which I'm going to go ahead and show you a sample of. This is pretty much a big map to show everything that we accomplished with that AWS Amplify setup. You can see that we've created a bunch of different information with our Cognito user pools and client ID, which will be useful for logging in later. There's an OAuth section, which I just threw in a basic template, but you can update with actual information. You can see the S3 buckets here, and then of course all of our AppSync information. And so it's pretty cool that we were able to use all these different resources, I think 5 different AWS programs, and it was all just done in less than 10 minutes and is cleanly mapped out here. So with all that said, what these are really all mapping to are our different locations in AWS. You can see in Cognito, we've created a new pool. Be ignoring that for the rest of today. In S3, we had a new one created, which I'm going to go ahead and ignore for the rest of today. The 2 big ones that I care about are our table, which is our actual NoSQL database, which is going to be our pictures. Looks right. Those are the 2 pictures of my dog and photo that you can see pulling into the app. And the other one that we're going to be focusing on a lot is AWS AppSync, which this is a different tutorial I've worked on, and this is the one that we just created. And, straight up and going, we can see that the schema has already been created, defining all of those resources and putting them here. And additionally, which is another thing that AppSync handles very nicely, is that it's already created our resolvers for us. These resolvers are really what are telling AWS which resources to update with these functions. So for example, if we look at our mutations, we already have a create picture, which it shows that it is connected to picture table as the resolver, which is this that we were just looking at. So if you dig into it, you can see that picture table is the data source selected, and then there's a bunch of configuring for the mapping template and also just the response mapping template. Now, these look really intimidating at first. They're written in, what was the name for it? In Apache VLC, which at least, or VTL, sorry, which for now, you can at least just think of it as a basic mapping of how to set into our data. We'll dive back into it in a little bit, but for now, most of it just works out of the box as planned. And so getting all of that set up is a huge help moving forward. And yeah, that's pretty much how this app is already working, is we have our queries set up and they are already reaching out to our AppSync. It's processing those queries and mutations, connecting them through our resolvers to our database, and then relaying that information back to our app. And when you look at our actual page, say for example our all photos, you can see that this query list pictures is being called from this GraphQL folder and then being connected directly to our React component using this layout of wrapping the GraphQL query around the component with a few options here to specify. So all of that together is just making this already work. So with all of that, we should be able to add our delete button pretty easily. Now, I'm going to start working from the data forward to the user side. And so for a start, the first thing we're going to want to do is check that we have a way to take those pictures and delete them and have functions to call for it. So for example, we're going to want to have a mutation for deleting a function, or I'm sorry, a picture, which we're going to have that line somewhere around here. You can see our mutation for delete picture has already been set up, and it's taking a delete picture input. And when we look at what that input means, it is simply just an ID of the one we want to delete. Now it's pretty common for them to be separated into create picture, delete picture, and so forth. It's not necessary, but you're just so often needing different data. Like for example, create is going to want a lot of information on creation, where delete doesn't need to know as much. So it's pretty natural for this, delete, and update to all be a little different. And so those are both looking pretty good to me. As a side note, we're not going to be getting too much into subscriptions today, but just know that it is also automatically connecting our delete picture mutation to onDeletePicture, which is going to help us keep our app up to date in real time. And lastly, if you look at our mutations, you can see that delete picture is already set up. And just a quick touch on what we were getting at earlier with the mapping here, you can see that this one is much shorter than that create one that I'd been showing earlier. And that's because a lot of it is not strictly necessary. Like this is actually what the file looked like beforehand, and I simply just deleted everything above this bracket right here. So this is the main crux of what we're caring about here. So I'll get back more into it later, but just know that this is really the only bit that you need to worry too much about. So I wouldn't worry too much about it long term, at least on your more simplified apps. So with our with our resolver set up on our mutation for deletion, I feel like our backend's already looking really good. Our next step from there would be to make sure that our queries are working. And this is a good opportunity to use the queries section of AWS AppSync. This is, if you've used GraphQL before, you've probably used something like Graphical or GraphQL Playground to sort of be a sandbox for testing out your different queries. And this not only works as a sandbox, but it also actively changes our data. And I'll show you a little bit about that. If we start with these out-of-the-box queries that we were looking at earlier that Amplify made for us, we have one that gets us picture using a single ID. So let's just go ahead and take this query and pop it straight in. Now, in order to set that variable, we're going to go down here, create the ID inside a variable, and then pass it one of our pictures. Looks like the one down there right now is no longer around, so I'll add my dog ID down here. Not quite. Let me try to paste that again. There we go. And as you can see, now we're pulling my dog. Pretty simple. So now we know that this query is working and it's getting us our information. Now let's say that I want to change it. We have a update picture sitting here. It mutates using an update picture input. So we can put that right there. I'm going to go to my schema to see what an update picture input looks like. And sure enough, we can see that it requires at least one ID, but that all the other fields are different, or optional, I should say. Now, name is the one that I want to change, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. We're going to start with ID of that same one, and I want to change it from name of my dog to my pet. And straight off the bat, we are going to see this fail because it's a slightly different input. This one needs to be wrapped in a input type. Still not happy here, is it? And that would be why. There we go. Now when we run it, we can see that it has pulled the data for my pet, which is ID 7DB. Sure enough, when we go over here and refresh it, we'll see that it now shows my pet instead of my dog as the name, which is what we want. So this is just a really powerful tool for if you want to test things, if you need to mutate something in the console for some reason. It's just a really good thing to keep in mind. And so based on all of that, I'm just going to go in here and go ahead and create my own mutation for deleting. They called theirs mutation create picture, so I'm just going to call mine mutation delete picture. And I'm going to start and just go ahead and copy over what I've already written down from earlier, importing the basic GraphQL label, setting the same mutation with an input of delete picture input type. It's going to allow me to use a delete picture based on that input with these different fields. And so as simple as that, that should work. So we have our resolver, our update to the schema, we have a query calling that. The next step now is going to be to connect it to the component it's inside. In this case, I kind of want my button to be right here for deleting, and so I want it to be in the section that holds all of this information, which is the all photos section. So I'm just going to go ahead and import mutation delete picture. It's slightly different syntax than above, but I just kind of prefer writing it this way. And looks like caught a misspelling there. And additionally, I'm going to add in a compose function here because that is going to be important moving down here. Because down here right now we have our all photos component wrapped in a single GraphQL query. And we want two different queries to be in here, or I should say a query and a mutation. In order to do so, we are going to have to put both in. So for the sake of expedience, I'm going to go ahead and copy some of it, but the main way I would do is you add compose in at the top, and now this is a main higher level one in which you are going to put both of these. GraphQL needs to be used on every single one that you're using. And so you would do something along this format to wrap them all in. My final layout is going to be like this. And so you can see I'm simply leaving this exact same layout from before, only I'm putting it in a list and adding in this mutate delete picture. I'm not going to go too much into detail about what's being accomplished here, but the large thing is that we are defining props and adding a delete picture function that takes a user input to the props. And based on that, we're going to return a promise to mutate using variables from that input. And after that process is done, refetch this query list pictures function or query so that we can update our cache with the new information on our database. So I'm going to quick save that to just verify it hasn't crashed our app at all. And it does look good. So now that it's actually in our app, the last step is to simply connect it to our user function. So the first step I'm going to do with that is just add a button inside this table section. And I'm thinking I want to put it between created at and download. So I'm going to stick it in right here. It's simply a button inside of this table cell formatting that the tutorial is using. But important is that I'm putting an onClick function using this onDelete picture, which is a function we're yet to create, and passing in the photo object. These different rows are being created using a map function, passing all the information about a photo in a special area. And so I want to pass all that information onto this function. And what's interesting with GraphQL is that it passes everything to these props. So if I quick console log the props on here, you can see that the props right now are that delete picture we just added, as well as photos, which contains all this information. So anytime I pass a photo to this function, it is going to pass me all of this information, which the ID is mainly what I care about, but who knows, down the line, this could also be really useful to have available. So I have my delete function calling that information, or button I should say, and I'm going to add a table header to this so that it's formatted correctly. Now on save, we can see we have our delete header with our buttons. But right now, they're just going to crash our app because this onDelete picture is not a function yet. So we need to create our onDelete picture. I can just throw this right under the onHandle download that's above. This is going to be an async function since it is calling our AWS resources, and I'm going to pass that photo variable in there as well. Now I'm creating an input. You don't strictly need to do this, you can just pass the information directly in, but for me I just feel like it makes it really obvious what it is being passed in, and so I just like the clarity of it. Now what we're creating for the input is based strictly on our schema. Where we are trying to emulate all of this, we need to add, our delete function needs to have a delete picture input sent to it, which strictly only needs the ID. In fact, if I was writing this, I would make it mandatory, as not passing anything wouldn't make sense. But, you know, for now I'm just going to leave it as is. And so once we have that input taking the ID from our photo object, I'm going to go ahead and call our this.props delete picture input and pass that input to it. Now, before we do so, I'm just going to quick add in a couple files so that you can see this happen in more real time. Okay, everything looking good. Now I'm going to go ahead and try to delete E. And there it is. You can see it deleting in real time. And you can see that reflected in our database. Currently have 4. I go back, delete the R, goes away instantly. And sure enough, down to 3. And so it's really as simple as that. We just go through those steps again. We're just at the beginning. We have our delete picture input and our delete picture function. We're making sure our resolver is connected, ideally. We're going over here creating a query or a mutation so that we can change and delete it to talk to our AppSync backend. We're then going to the component we want it to be called in, importing it here, wrapping it around our current React component using a compose function, and then we are calling this function on click that is calling our query mutation using the props. Pretty cool, right? So, I mean, that's pretty much it for the large tutorial. Last little bits I want to touch back on are, for one, updating these sections at the bottom. It's worth mentioning that a lot of these names are arbitrary. There's not strictly a delete picture, even though that's what we had listed. I want this to be fun, and so I'm going to name it delete picture raws. And in fact, I'm just going to do this name variables name. Now when we load it, everything's just as fine, just instead our function's name delete picture Aws. This props delete picture is not a function. But yeah, you know what I'm getting at. If I renamed it to the delete picture Aws, it would work. And so a lot of these can just be changed. And this isn't super important, but it's just worth knowing. You don't need to memorize a lot of these from your data. And that also, if you want to homogenize things across your app, it's important not to reuse some of these keyboards. For example, if I'm going to be calling a mutate and a create and a update, then perhaps I don't want to name all of them photo because those are going to start overlapping each other over here. I already have a photos, and so this cannot be used multiple times. So that's worth remembering. Additionally, I mentioned briefly this refresh queries and how this forces this to reload. Getting things to sync correctly is a big issue with GraphQL. You'd really want all of your data to be up to date regardless. So when we're using our React app, it's really important that we have everything deleting in real time. If I get rid of this, then you'll kind of see what I mean. We're going to go over here and delete E, and nothing happens. Or at least it looks that way. E is no longer in my list, but you just can't tell on the user side. When I refresh, you get it. But obviously, that's not great user experience. So it's really important to find a solution to deal with issues like that. And that's kind of where getting into the nuances of these is really more important. I've seen these things stretch down a number of lines, and just it's worth bearing in mind that there's a lot of editing you can do and a lot of situations where you might need it to be more complex, such as updating here. Even this solution isn't good enough for, say, a Facebook type feed, where since my update is tied strictly to my actions, if another user deleted one of these, for example, I wouldn't know until I refreshed my page and forced that query again. So it's just something to keep in mind. Additionally, I just want to talk a little bit more about these resolvers. When we were looking at the mutation function earlier, I mentioned how much shorter they can be. Again, there was that really long section that was set for authorization, which actually I'm going to go ahead and take a look at. If you take a look at this create one, you can see that all of this is relating to authorization and checking all of that information. But this is really the crux of it. And so if you go ahead again and just delete all of this, it really does work as fine. As these things get more complicated, obviously a lot of that more information does become important. But for base level simple apps, this is pretty much good enough. In the past, I've straight up just, changed put item to delete item, and just copy pasted that into a new resolver, and it worked just fine. So, it's definitely worth taking a look more into the VTL as needed, this language here, but out of the box, if you're just looking to get something going, it is pretty simple to just let these defaults write it out. Another last thing I want to touch on is creating resources. They kind of auto-created our picture inputs, but obviously things can get a little more complicated as time goes by. So if we use create resource here, we can actually just create a new table in resource to use. We could theoretically use an existing type, like create a table for another picture table, S3 objects, so forth. But let's just say I want to update events. I'm going to create an event type, and I'm going to give it a list of attendees. And every item in the list needs to exist. And then here, you can see it's already like updating that auto name right here. It's defaulting to event table, giving a primary key and sort key. And then here are all the different schema that they are just auto-generating for us. With those 2 queries, the same 3 mutations, same 3 subscriptions, and a bunch of other helpful inputs. And so if I create that, table event filler input. Okay. Then you can see that it's just already going to go ahead and create all that. And so this just speeds things up a lot and makes it a lot more user-friendly and easy to use. Once this is done loading, you'll be able to find all of this already. And the best part is they're already plugged in. Here's our create events mutation. And when you go to it, it's already connected to our events table. And it already has all this information with the put item to connect it. So that's all really helpful. I would say that's the main gist with all of this app. I hope you found it helpful. For me, GraphQL has been a really powerful tool, particularly with AppSync, to help plug into all my other AWS servers. and just help making API calls between all my different resources that much simpler. And particularly as someone who focuses on front-end web design, I like all of the freedom that these allow me in sort of defining what information I do want from GraphQL. And so just as a final send-off, again, this is Luke with Serverless Guru. We're a company that focuses on helping other companies sort of make the best of their resources, be it training their employees to work with AWS, creating or updating their current setup to work with AWS cloud resources, or just straight up helping them build their websites out and providing assistance as needed. So there's a lot of flexibility there. And if you're interested in learning more about us, you can reach out at www.serverlessguru.com. Beyond that, I would love to hear any feedback you have on this video, hear your thoughts and opinions. Any feedback is welcome, and so I hope you enjoyed this and found it informative, and hope to see you again.